What's the most unfair thing a teacher ever did to you? When I was 17, I thought Ms. Hartwell was the coolest teacher at Roosevelt High. She taught advanced creative writing and had this reputation for being tough but fair. Her classroom walls were covered with published stories from former students. I wanted my work up there more than anything. For our final project, we had to write a 5,000-word short story on any topic. I'd been working on mine for months. A psychological thriller about a girl who discovers her neighbor is hiding something sinister. I spent weeks perfecting every sentence, staying up until 3 a.m., polishing dialogue and building suspense. The night before it was due, I printed it out and read it one final time. I knew it was good, really good, maybe the best thing I'd ever written. 2 weeks later, Ms. Hartwell handed back everyone's papers except mine. "Lydia, please stay after class," she said, her voice cold. My stomach dropped. When the room emptied, she pulled out my story and slammed it on her desk. "Where did you get this?" she demanded. I stared at her, confused. "What do you mean?" "Don't play dumb. This is clearly plagiarized. There's no way a high school student wrote something this sophisticated." The words hit me like a slap. "I wrote every word myself. I can prove it. I have all my drafts saved on my computer." She crossed her arms. "Anyone can create fake drafts. I've been teaching for 20 years. I know student work when I see it, and this isn't yours. But it is mine. I worked on it for months. I'm giving you one chance to tell me the truth. Admit you copied this, and I'll only fail you for the assignment. Lie to me, and I'll recommend you for expulsion." My hands were shaking. "Ms. Hartwell, I swear on my life that I wrote this story. Please, just look at my other work. You'll see the writing style is consistent." She shook her head. "Your other work is mediocre at best. This is professional quality. Stop insulting my intelligence." That afternoon, I went home and gathered everything. My handwritten notes, multiple drafts with timestamps, even my browser history showing research I'd done for specific details. I brought it all to her the next morning. Ms. Hartwell barely glanced at the evidence. "This proves nothing. Anyone can fabricate documents." She reported me to the principal for academic dishonesty. Dr. Brennan called my parents for a meeting. I sat in his office while Ms. Hartwell explained how I'd submitted clearly plagiarized work and was now doubling down with fabricated evidence. My dad looked at me with disappointment I'd never seen before. "Lydia, just tell the truth. We'll figure this out." "I am telling the truth," I screamed, tears streaming down my face. "I wrote that story." Dr. Brennan reviewed my file. "Lydia's always been an exemplary student, but this is a serious accusation." Ms. Hartwell leaned forward. "I've been teaching longer than she's been alive. I know plagiarism when I see it." They gave me a 0 on the assignment and put a note in my permanent file. Ms. Hartwell announced to the class that plagiarism wouldn't be tolerated, while staring directly at me. My classmates whispered behind my back. My best friend Donovan was the only one who believed me. For weeks, I felt like I was drowning. My GPA dropped. College applications were due soon. The shame followed me everywhere. Then I discovered something that changed everything. I was researching colleges online when I stumbled across a literary magazine from 2019. My blood froze. There was my story, word for word, published under Ms. Hartwell's name. I screenshotted everything, my hands trembling as I scrolled through the digital pages. The publication date was 3 years before I'd even written it, or so I thought. But something didn't add up. I checked the timestamps on my files. I'd created the first draft in September. The magazine was published in August of that same year. Ms. Hartwell had submitted my story and gotten it published while accusing me of plagiarism. My head was spinning. How was this possible? I stayed up all night piecing it together. Ms. Hartwell had access to our Google Classroom where we submitted drafts for feedback. She'd been watching my story develop for months, commenting on early versions, suggesting improvements. I'd thought she was being helpful. The more I dug, the sicker I felt. I found her submission confirmation email in a screenshot she'd accidentally left in a shared folder. She'd stolen my story in July, polished it slightly using my own revisions, and submitted it under her name. The acceptance letter was dated 2 weeks before she accused me of plagiarism. She'd stolen my story, submitted it for publication, then accused me of stealing from her when I turned in the final version. I called Donovan at midnight, my voice shaking. "You need to see this," I said. "Can you come over?" 20 minutes later, he was sitting at my kitchen table, staring at the evidence spread across the surface. "Holy shit," he whispered. "She actually stole your story and published it." "What do I do?" I asked. "Who's going to believe me? She's already convinced everyone I'm a cheater." Donovan leaned back in his chair. "We document everything. Every timestamp, every comment, every piece of evidence. Then we bury her." But before I could confront anyone, I needed to understand the full scope of what had happened. I spent the next 3 days becoming a digital detective, combing through every file, every backup, every cached version I could find. What I discovered was a calculated theft that had been planned for months. Ms. Hartwell hadn't just stolen my final story. She'd been monitoring my creative process from the beginning, taking notes on my techniques, even copying my character development methods for her own work. I found a document on her shared drive titled Student Inspiration that contained excerpts from at least a dozen student stories, including mine. She'd been systematically harvesting our creativity, using us as unpaid ghostwriters for her publications. The worst part was discovering her correspondence with editors. She'd pitched my story concept to 3 different magazines before settling on the one that accepted it. In her query letter, she described it as a deeply personal exploration of paranoia and trust, claiming it was inspired by her own childhood trauma, my sleepless nights developing those characters, my careful research into police procedures and forensic psychology. She'd packaged my emotional investment as her own life experience. The next morning, I printed everything. My drafts with timestamps, her feedback comments, the published story with her name on it, the submission confirmations I'd found. I even printed her enthusiastic email responses to my early drafts, where she'd written things like, "This twist is brilliant," and "You have real talent, Lydia." I marched straight to Dr. Brennan's office, my evidence folder thick enough to choke a horse. "I need to speak with you immediately," I said, spreading the papers across his desk. Dr. Brennan's face went white as he reviewed the evidence. The timestamps clearly showed my story existing months before publication. Ms. Hartwell's own feedback comments proved she'd seen my work develop. "This is very serious," he said quietly. "I'm calling Ms. Hartwell in here right now." When she walked in 15 minutes later, her confidence evaporated the moment she saw the papers spread across the desk. "Can you explain this?" Dr. Brennan asked, pointing to the published story. Ms. Hartwell's face flushed red. That's not, there must be some mistake." "The mistake was thinking you wouldn't get caught," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. She tried to spin it, claiming I'd somehow accessed her unpublished work, but the evidence was overwhelming. Google Classroom showed every revision, every comment, every timestamp. The submission emails were dated after my initial drafts, but before my final submission. "You watched me develop this story for months," I said, my anger finally bubbling over. "You encouraged me, helped me make it better, then stole it and tried to destroy my reputation to cover your tracks." Dr. Brennan looked sick. "Ms. Hartwell, I need you to return to your classroom and gather your personal items. You're suspended pending a full investigation." She stood there for a moment, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. Then she turned and walked out without another word. But that was just the beginning. Dr. Brennan called my parents immediately. When they arrived an hour later, Mom was crying before she even sat down. "We're so sorry," Dad said, his voice thick with emotion. "We should have believed you. We should have fought for you. You couldn't have known," I said, though part of me was still hurt they'd doubted me. She was very convincing. "That doesn't matter," Mom said fiercely. "You're our daughter. We should have trusted you over anyone else." The school board meeting was scheduled for the following week. Dr. Brennan recommended immediate termination, but the board wanted to conduct their own investigation. Ms. Hartwell hired a lawyer who claimed the whole thing was a misunderstanding. Her lawyer's strategy was disgusting. He suggested I was a troubled student seeking attention, that I'd somehow forged the timestamps, that my erratic behavior proved I was lying. He even brought up my parents' divorce from 5 years earlier, implying I had abandonment issues that made me prone to fabrication. "Young people today are sophisticated with technology," he argued. "Creating fake timestamps and documents is well within a teenager's capabilities." I had to testify in front of the school board, a panel of 5 adults who looked at me like I was either a victim or a criminal. Ms. Hartwell sat across the room with her lawyer, refusing to make eye contact. "Walk us through your writing process," board member Mrs. Patterson said gently. I explained everything. How I'd gotten the initial idea from a news story about a missing person. How I'd researched police procedures and interviewed my uncle, who was a detective. How I'd written and rewritten the opening scene 17 times until it felt right. "I have every draft saved," I said. "Every Google Doc revision. Every comment Ms. Hartwell made. You can see the story evolving over months." Ms. Hartwell's lawyer stood up. "Your Honor, this isn't a courtroom," Dr. Brennan interrupted sharply. "Board members," the lawyer corrected himself. "My client has been teaching for over 2 decades. She's won awards. Why would she risk her career for one student story?" I looked directly at Ms. Hartwell for the first time. "Because you thought you could get away with it. You thought a high school student would never find out her teacher had stolen her work." Finally, she spoke. "I was trying to help you. Your story had potential, but it needed significant revision. I may have used it as inspiration for my own work." "Inspiration?" I stood up, my voice rising. "You copied it word for word and published it under your name." The board called for a recess. During the break, Dr. Brennan pulled me aside. "How are you holding up?" he asked. "I feel like I'm on trial," I admitted. "Like they think I'm the criminal here." "You're not. You're incredibly brave for coming forward. Most students would have just accepted the punishment." When we reconvened, the board announced they were bringing in an independent digital forensics expert to verify all the evidence. The expert would examine every file, every timestamp, every piece of digital evidence to determine the truth. The investigation took 2 weeks. They brought in Dr. Michelle Santos, a former FBI cybercrime investigator who now worked as a consultant. She spent hours examining my computer, Ms. Hartwell's school files, and the Google Classroom data. During those 2 weeks, the story leaked to local media. Someone on the school board had spoken to a reporter friend, and suddenly my name was in the newspaper. The initial article was balanced, presenting both sides of the story. But the comment section was brutal. Some people called me a lying attention seeker. Others defended me, saying teachers in positions of power often abused students. A reporter from the local paper, Jennifer Walsh, contacted me for an interview. My parents wanted to decline, but our lawyer advised that staying silent might make me look guilty. The interview took place in our living room. Jennifer was kind but thorough, asking detailed questions about my writing process and the timeline of events. "Why do you think Ms. Hartwell chose your story specifically?" she asked. "Because it was good," I said simply, "and because she thought I was too young and naive to ever find out." The article ran the following Sunday with the headline, "Student Accuses Beloved Teacher of Literary Theft." It included quotes from other students defending Ms. Hartwell and calling her an inspiring educator. But it also included something unexpected. Jennifer had reached out to other schools where Ms. Hartwell had previously taught. At Riverside High, where she'd worked 5 years earlier, a former student named Marcus Rodriguez recognized his story about gang violence in the published excerpts Jennifer showed him. "I remember that story," Marcus told her. "Ms. Hartwell said it wasn't good enough for the school literary magazine, but I was proud of it. Seeing it published under her name, man, that hurts. Suddenly this wasn't just about me anymore. The digital forensics report came back conclusive. Dr. Anyao Santos confirmed that all my timestamps were authentic, that the Google Classroom data showed my story developing over months, and that Ms. Hartwell's submission to the literary magazine occurred after she'd had access to my final draft. There is no doubt, Dr. Santos reported to the school board, that the student created this work independently and that the teacher subsequently appropriated it for publication under her own name. The board voted unanimously to terminate Ms. Hartwell's contract. They also referred the case to the state licensing board and contacted the local prosecutor about potential criminal charges. But the revelations were just beginning. Jennifer Walsh's follow-up investigation uncovered a pattern of theft spanning Ms. Hartwell's entire career. She'd taught at 4 different schools over 20 years, and at each one, there were students whose work bore suspicious similarities to stories she'd later published. The most heartbreaking case was Samantha Kim, who'd attended Westfield Prep 10 years earlier. Samantha had written a powerful story about her experience as a Korean adoptee searching for her birth parents. Ms. Hartwell had published a version of it and won a $5,000 prize in a national short story competition. I shared the most painful part of my life with her, Samantha said in a phone interview with Jennifer. She told me the story was too personal, too raw for publication. Then she cleaned it up and won money with my trauma. By the time the investigation was complete, 7 former students had come forward with evidence of plagiarism. Ms. Hartwell had systematically stolen student work throughout her career, earning over $20,000 in prize money and publication fees. The school board meeting to finalize her termination was packed. Local news stations covered it. Protesters outside carried signs reading, "Protect student voices," and "Teachers should inspire, not steal." Ms. Hartwell attended with her lawyer, maintaining her innocence despite the overwhelming evidence. In her final statement to the board, she actually had the audacity to claim she was the victim. "I have devoted my life to nurturing young writers," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, I may have drawn inspiration from my students' work, but that's what teachers do. We build on their ideas. This witch hunt has destroyed my career and my reputation over what amounts to a misunderstanding about creative collaboration." I was given a chance to respond. Standing at the podium, looking out at the packed room, I felt a calm clarity I hadn't experienced in months. "Ms. Hartwell didn't inspire us," I said. "She exploited us. She took our most personal stories, our creative breakthroughs, our emotional vulnerabilities, and she profited from them. She didn't just steal our words, she stole our trust in the educational system." I paused, looking directly at her. And she's still lying. Even now, faced with irrefutable evidence, she's calling this a misunderstanding. That's not someone who should be trusted with students' creative development. The board's unanimous vote to terminate her was met with applause from the gallery, but the damage to my reputation at school was complex. Some students rallied around me, organizing Truth Matters campaigns and wearing t-shirts supporting academic integrity. Donovan became something of a hero for standing by me from the beginning. Others, particularly Ms. Hartwell's former favorite students, struggled to accept what had happened. Celia Martinez confronted me in the hallway after the termination announcement. "I hope you're happy," she said bitterly. "You destroyed a woman's entire life." "She destroyed her own life when she chose to steal from students," I replied. "I just exposed it." "But did you have to be so public about it? You could have handled this privately." Donovan, who'd been walking with me, stepped in. "Privately? Like the 7 other students who stayed quiet and watched her steal their work? Sometimes the only way to stop a pattern of abuse is to shine a light on it." The conversation encapsulated the division in our school. About half the students supported me, understanding that what Ms. Hartwell had done was serious. The other half felt I'd gone too far, that I'd ruined a good teacher over a misunderstanding. The teachers were similarly divided. Most supported me professionally, understanding the seriousness of plagiarism, but a few seemed to resent that a student had brought down a colleague. My new creative writing teacher, Mr. Davidson, went out of his way to create a supportive environment. On my first day in his class, he addressed the situation directly. "What happened with Ms. Hartwell was a betrayal of everything we stand for as educators," he said. "In this classroom, your work is sacred. I'm here to help you improve it, not to profit from it." He implemented new policies to protect student work, including signed acknowledgments for every piece submitted and secure, time-stamped storage systems. Meanwhile, the legal consequences for Ms. Hartwell continued to unfold. The state education department launched a formal investigation into her licensing. The literary magazines that had published her stolen work demanded refunds of prize money and publication fees. But the criminal case was more complicated. The prosecutor, DA Elena Vasquez, explained that while Ms. Hartwell's actions were clearly unethical, proving criminal copyright infringement was challenging. "Student work submitted for class assignments exists in a legal gray area," she explained to my parents and me. "Unlike published authors, students don't typically register copyrights for their classwork. It makes prosecution difficult." She decided to pursue charges of fraud and theft by deception instead, arguing that Ms. Hartwell had fraudulently claimed authorship for financial gain. The case never went to trial. Ms. Hartwell's lawyer negotiated a plea deal where she would pay restitution to all affected students and perform community service, but avoid jail time. "She's already lost her career and her reputation," DA Vasquez explained. "Sometimes that's punishment enough." I wasn't entirely satisfied with the outcome, but I understood the practical limitations of the legal system. The civil case was more successful. 7 students, including me, filed a joint lawsuit for damages. We weren't seeking massive payouts. Most of us just wanted the principle established that student intellectual property deserved protection. The settlement required Ms. Hartwell to pay each affected student $5,000 in damages, plus legal fees. More importantly, It established legal precedent for protecting student creative work. College application season was surreal. The plagiarism scandal had made me something of a minor celebrity in education circles. Some schools were clearly intrigued by the controversy. They saw me as a student who'd shown exceptional courage and integrity. Others seemed nervous about admitting someone who'd been involved in such a public dispute with a teacher. I could sense the hesitation during interviews. "Tell us about your experience with academic integrity," one admissions officer said carefully. "I learned that standing up for what's right isn't always easy or popular," I replied, "but it's always necessary." Northwestern University's journalism school was particularly interested in my story. Professor Linda Chen, who headed their investigative journalism program, called personally to discuss my application. "What you did demonstrates exactly the kind of ethical backbone we want in future journalists," she said. "You investigated thoroughly, documented everything, and weren't intimidated by authority figures trying to silence you." I was accepted with a partial scholarship specifically for students who'd shown courage in exposing institutional wrongdoing. The media attention continued throughout my senior year. Jennifer Walsh's investigation won a state journalism award, and she invited me to the ceremony as her guest. "Your courage made this story possible," she told me. "You could have stayed quiet and taken the punishment, but you chose to fight back. That's what journalism is about, giving voice to people who've been wronged." At the awards ceremony, I met other investigative journalists who shared stories of exposing corruption and abuse. It was inspiring to see how many people dedicated their careers to uncovering truth. "The powerful only stay powerful when the powerless stay silent," one veteran reporter told me. "You learned that lesson young." My graduation speech focused on the importance of speaking up when you witness injustice, even when it's scary. 6 months ago, I was just another high school student worried about grades and college applications," I said. "I never expected to become an advocate for student rights or to challenge a system that I thought was designed to protect me." I looked out at my classmates, many of whom had been on different sides of the controversy. What I learned is that staying silent in the face of wrongdoing doesn't protect anyone. It just enables more wrongdoing. Yes, speaking up can be costly. It can be lonely. It can make people uncomfortable. But silence is costlier, lonelier, and more uncomfortable for the victims who suffer in isolation. After graduation, several underclassmen approached me to share their own stories of questionable teacher behavior. Some were minor, teachers showing favoritism or being unprofessional. Others were more serious. One sophomore, Jasmine Torres, told me about her art teacher who'd been copying student designs and selling them online. "I was afraid to say anything because I thought people would blame me for ruining her career," Jasmine said. "But seeing what you did made me realize that she's the one responsible for her actions, not me." Jasmine filed a formal complaint with the school administration. The art teacher was investigated and ultimately resigned. Another student, Alex Martinez, shared that his computer science teacher had been submitting student coding projects to hackathons and keeping the prize money. "I designed an app for tracking homework assignments," Alex explained. 3 months later, I saw it winning a regional competition with my teacher's name on it. These stories reinforced something I'd come to understand. Ms. Hartwell wasn't an isolated case. Academic exploitation of students happened more often than people wanted to admit. That summer, before starting college, I was contacted by the National Education Association. They wanted me to speak at their annual conference about student intellectual property rights. "Your case has sparked a nationwide conversation about protecting student creativity," Dr. Patricia Williams, their ethics committee chair, explained. "We want to turn this moment into lasting policy change." The conference was in Chicago, with over 3,000 educators in attendance. I was nervous about speaking to such a large audience of teachers, the same profession as Ms. Hartwell, but the reception was overwhelmingly positive. These were educators who genuinely cared about their students and were horrified by what Ms. Hartwell had done. "She betrayed everything we stand for," one elementary teacher told me after my presentation. "Thank you for having the courage to expose her." My speech focused on practical steps schools could take to protect student work, better documentation systems, clear policies about intellectual property, and regular training for teachers about ethical boundaries. "Students trust you with their most creative, personal work," I told the audience. "That trust is sacred. When you violate it, you don't just harm individual students. You damage the entire educational relationship." The NEA adopted new guidelines for teacher conduct regarding student intellectual property. They also created a reporting system for students who suspected their work had been stolen. College was a fresh start, but the experience with Ms. Hartwell continued to shape my perspective. I majored in investigative journalism with a minor in education policy, determined to keep shining light on institutional wrongdoing. My freshman year journalism professor, Dr. Amanda Foster, had followed my story in the news. "You've already done more real investigative work than most journalism students do in 4 years," she said. "But there's always more to learn about gathering evidence, verifying sources, and presenting findings objectively." She was right. While my investigation of Ms. Hartwell had been thorough, it was driven by personal motivation. Learning to apply those same skills to issues I wasn't personally involved in was a different challenge. My first major college investigation focused on grade inflation at private schools. I spent months interviewing students, teachers, and admissions officers, documenting how some expensive prep schools were artificially boosting GPAs to help wealthy students get into elite colleges. The story was published in the university newspaper and picked up by several education publications. It felt good to use my investigative skills to expose a broader systemic problem. During my sophomore year, I was contacted by a producer from a national news program who wanted to do a documentary about student intellectual property theft. They'd heard about other cases similar to mine and wanted to explore whether this was a widespread problem. The documentary, titled Stolen Voices: When Teachers Steal from Students, featured my story alongside 4 other cases from across the country. Each case had a similar pattern: a trusted teacher systematically stealing student work for personal profit. The most shocking case featured Dr. Raymond Burke, a college professor who'd been submitting undergraduate research papers to academic journals under his own name for over a decade. He'd built his entire academic reputation on stolen student work. The power dynamic makes it almost impossible for students to challenge professors, explained Dr. Sarah Chen, an education law expert interviewed for the documentary. Students depend on these faculty members for grades, recommendations, and career advancement. Speaking up feels like academic suicide. The documentary sparked congressional hearings on intellectual property protections for students. I was invited to testify before the House Education Committee about my experience and the need for stronger legal protections. Sitting in that hearing room in Washington, facing a panel of congresspeople, I thought about the 17-year-old girl who'd been too scared to challenge a teacher's accusation of plagiarism. She never could have imagined her story would reach this level. Student creativity deserves the same protection as professional intellectual property, I testified. When we fail to protect young voices, we discourage innovation and betray the fundamental trust that makes education possible. The hearing led to the Student Intellectual Property Protection Act, which established federal guidelines for how schools must handle student creative work and created legal remedies for theft. By my junior year, I'd become something of an expert on education policy and student rights. I was regularly invited to speak at conferences and consulted on policy development, but I never lost sight of the personal impact of these issues. Every policy discussion, every legal framework, every institutional reform was ultimately about protecting individual students like the person I'd been. Ms. Hartwell, meanwhile, had largely disappeared from public view. I heard occasional updates through the education network I'd become part of. She'd moved to Arizona and was working in retail management. Her teaching license had been permanently revoked in 42 states. A friend of a friend spotted her working at a bookstore in Phoenix and said she looked older, tired, diminished. Part of me felt sorry for her. She'd thrown away a 2-decade career for relatively small financial gains. But then I'd remember Samantha Kim's voice breaking as she described seeing her adoption story published under Ms. Hartwell's name, and my sympathy would evaporate. During my senior year, I wrote my thesis on the long-term psychological impact of academic exploitation on students. I interviewed dozens of people who'd had their work stolen by teachers or professors. The patterns were disturbing. Many never fully trusted educational institutions again. Some stopped pursuing creative work entirely, convinced their ideas weren't good enough to protect. Others became hypervigilant about documenting their creative process, unable to relax into the natural flow of creativity. It's a form of institutional betrayal, explained Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a trauma specialist I interviewed. When the very people meant to nurture your development exploit it instead, it creates lasting damage to your ability to trust authority figures. I was fortunate that my experience, while traumatic, had led to positive change and validation. Many victims of academic exploitation suffered in silence, never receiving acknowledgement or justice. My thesis advisor, Professor James Liu, encouraged me to publish my research in academic journals. "This is important work," he said. "You're documenting a form of harm that's been largely invisible in academic literature." The paper was published in the Journal of Educational Ethics and later cited in numerous studies about student-teacher power dynamics. As graduation approached, I reflected on how completely the experience with Ms. Hartwell had shaped my college years and career path. Without her theft of my story, I might never have discovered my passion for investigative journalism or education policy. It was a strange irony. Her attempt to steal my future had actually clarified it. Job offers came from several newspapers and magazines, all interested in my background investigating education issues. I chose the Washington Post's education desk, excited to continue exposing systemic problems in schools and universities. My first major assignment was investigating a charter school network that was inflating test scores by excluding struggling students from state assessment. The investigation took 6 months and resulted in federal oversight of the entire network. "You have a gift for this work," my editor, Maria Santos, told me. "You understand how to dig into institutional failures while never losing sight of the human impact." The charter school story won a regional journalism award. But more importantly, it led to reforms that better served students with learning disabilities. 3 years into my career at the Post, I received an unexpected email. It was from Ms. Hartwell. The subject line read, "Long overdue apology." I stared at the email for an hour before opening it. "Dear Lydia," it began, "I know I have no right to contact you, and I understand if you delete this without reading further, but I wanted you to know that I've spent the last 5 years in therapy, trying to understand how I could have done what I did to you and other students." She went on to describe her struggle with depression and financial stress that had led her to make increasingly desperate choices. She detailed her progression from borrowing inspiration from student work to outright theft. "I told myself I was helping students by giving their ideas a platform they couldn't access themselves," she wrote. "I convinced myself that publication under my name was better than no publication at all. I see now how self-serving and destructive that thinking was." The email was several pages long, acknowledging each student she'd wronged by name and describing the specific harm she'd caused. "Your courage in exposing my theft saved other students from experiencing what you and the others went through," she continued. "I know this probably means nothing coming from me, but I'm proud of the journalist and advocate you've become. You turned my betrayal into a force for protecting other students." She ended by saying she didn't expect or deserve forgiveness, but wanted me to know that my actions had led to meaningful change in how she understood consent and intellectual property. I didn't respond to the email immediately. I needed time to process the complex emotions it stirred up. On one hand, I appreciated her acknowledgement of the harm she'd caused. It was more accountability than many victims of institutional betrayal ever receive. On the other hand, 5 years felt like a long time to wait for an apology, and part of me wondered if she was only reaching out because my career success made her theft look even worse in retrospect. I eventually sent a brief response thanking her for the apology and noting that the most meaningful amends she could make was to continue advocating for ethical treatment of students in whatever capacity she could. I never heard from her again. By my 5th year at the Post, I'd covered dozens of education stories: budget cuts, teacher shortages, standardized testing controversies, college admission scandals. Each story connected back to fundamental questions about power, accountability, and protecting the vulnerable. I'd also started speaking regularly at journalism schools about investigative techniques and ethics. Invariably, students would ask about my high school experience and how it shaped my career. The most important lesson wasn't about gathering evidence or confronting authority figures, I'd tell them. It was about understanding that silence in the face of wrongdoing is complicity. As journalists, our job is to give voice to people who've been harmed and to hold powerful institutions accountable. I'd usually end these talks by emphasizing that investigative journalism isn't about destroying people's lives. It's about exposing systems and behaviors that need to change. Ms. Hartwell made choices that harmed students, I'd explain. Exposing those choices wasn't an attack on her as a person. It was necessary to prevent future harm and to establish that intellectual property theft has consequences. Now, 10 years after the initial theft of my story, I'm an established investigative journalist with a national reputation for education reporting. I've exposed corruption in school districts, documented systematic bias in standardized testing, and revealed how predatory colleges exploit vulnerable students. My work has led to policy changes, criminal investigations, and millions of dollars in recovered funds for students who were defrauded. But I still think about that 17-year-old girl who almost stayed silent when her teacher accused her of plagiarism. What if I hadn't found that published story? What if I'd accepted the 0 grade and moved on? Ms. Hartwell would have continued stealing from students. The 7 other victims might never have gotten acknowledgement or justice. The policy changes protecting student intellectual property might never have happened. Sometimes the most important moment in your life is the one where you decide not to stay quiet. I keep a framed copy of my first published story, the one Ms. Hartwell stole, on my office wall. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder that your voice matters, even when powerful people try to silence it. Especially then. The story that nearly destroyed my faith in education ultimately became the foundation for a career dedicated to making educational institutions more just and accountable. Ms. Hartwell thought she was stealing my words. Instead, she accidentally taught me that some things are worth fighting for, no matter how scary it gets. My voice, my truth, my future, those were never hers to take.